Hi, my name is Nick from Accounting Add-ons, and in this video I'll show you how to pull data into Power BI Excel using OdataLink, but using a technique called a Power Query function. A Power Query function basically allows you to call the same endpoint multiple times and use parameters to actually control how that happens. And the benefit of this is to actually optimize the performance or give you actual control over how the data gets downloaded. So let's get into it. Now the first step is I'll jump to OdataLink and I'll copy the URL I want to use, and I'll use Xero as an example, but this technique is applicable to everything. I'll go back into Power BI, I'll get data from OData feed, I'll paste my URL and click OK. Now for the purpose of this example, I'll actually use two separate endpoints. I'll use the dates by month, which provides a table of various date range for each month, and I'll use the profit and loss report. And I'll click transform. The profit and loss data essentially has a series of parameters at the start, and the important bit is it provides a series of lines with the account details and the amount column basically. And what it essentially does is it provides a profit and loss for a specific date range. In this case it's going from the 1st of July to the 31st of July. My dates by months endpoint is a table that just has a series of dates. Now I'll filter it only to pull 12 months. I'll pull financial year 2021, and I'll actually remove all the columns that I'm not interested in. And the last step I'll do is transform these to dates only. Now that basically is just a simple table of dates. Before we create our function, we'll want to set up the parameters that it will use, and in this case we'll want a start date and an end date. So I'll go manage parameters, new parameter. I'll create a parameter called start date of type date, and I'll put a default value in it, and I'll add a new parameter called end date of type date and a default value. And I can click OK. You can see the two parameters have been added. So now what we'll want to do is apply those parameters to our profit and loss endpoint. We'll go to the profit and loss endpoint, and if you click on the little gear icon on the invoke step, you can actually see this endpoint is a function in OData that accepted a series of parameters. A from date, to date, payments, and standard, and all were left blank. If I cancel that and you look at the formula signature at the top, you can actually see it's got a series of null values being passed in, and that corresponds to the actual 4 parameters that the gear icon showed. So what we'll want to do on the first parameter is we'll type in start date, which is our start date parameter, and on the second one we'll type in the end date, and that will essentially pass the values in those 2 parameters in. The next step we'll do is we'll expand the line so we can actually see the data, and you can see this is what the profit and loss endpoint looks like in Xero. The final step will be to turn that profit and loss endpoint into a function, and to do that we can right click on profit and loss, choose create function and give it a name, and I'll call this get profit loss, and I'll click OK. You can actually see it's added a folder called get profit and loss. It's got inside that the endpoint, the 2 parameters and my function, and then I've got other queries, which is my dates by month. So now the only thing left is to tie all this in together. So in our dates by months endpoint, we've actually got a series of dates that we've prepared. And what we'll want to do is we'll want to call this function for each of these records. To do that, we can go add column, invoke custom function, and this will allow us to add a new column that I'll call data, and the function we'll call is the get profit and loss function. We'll set the start date to be a column, and we'll choose the first date, and the same value for end date. We'll choose a column, but we'll choose the last date. So now our function is ready. We can click OK, and what this will do is it'll add another column called data, which is of a type table, and inside that we can expand that endpoint, that column, and actually get access to the data. Now behind the scenes, what Power Query and Power BI have done is for every one of those records we've got, it will call the function, pass in the first date and the last date to the function, which will call the profit and loss and return it. And you can actually see I've got data for July, August, September, October, and if I scroll across, I can actually see my values. I also recommend that you look at every column and make sure that the format of the column is set correctly. You can actually see they're all set to ABC123, but some are dates and some are amounts. We'll go to the amount and we'll make sure it's set to a decimal number. We'll go to the date time and make sure it's set to a date time. There's a few more columns here from date to date, and we'll make sure those two are set to date as well. So now our data is prepared and invoked. The last step we'll do is we'll rename the dates by month to results. Lastly, what we'll want to do is go to the profit and loss endpoint, right click on it, and untick enable load. We want to do this because although we're using the profit and loss endpoint, we're actually not using it directly. We're using it indirectly through the get profit and loss function. And unticking enable load ensures that Power BI does not actually pull the data. It's going to be purely internal to Power Query, and Power Query will use it internally with itself. Once we've done that, we can click close and apply and refresh the data. You can actually see it's only loading the results. It's not loading the profit and loss default endpoint. Once it's finished, we're good to go and we can start building our dashboard. Now let's just tie it all together and make sure it's working. I'll add a simple table, and what I'll do, I'll just resize it a bit. I'll add the first date, I'll add the account name, I'll add the amount, and I'll ungroup the first date. I'll go to the account name and I'll filter it to just show net profit, and there it is. So you can actually see the dates were called, the net profit was produced, and this is the values that it generated. That's pretty much it for how to use that technique. So to recap, you can basically grab any endpoint you want and create a function from it, and from that step you can then actually call it multiple times by adding it as a custom function column on another endpoint. Hope you found this interesting, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.